Hi, everyone, and welcome to Clery Center Conversations. My name is Laura Egan, and I am joined today by my colleagues Sarah and Abby here at Clery Center to share with you some of our internal conversation and chatter around the latest development with the Clery Act, the rescission and archival of the 2016 Handbook for Campus Safety and Security Reporting. So we hope that in chatting through some of the more frequently asked questions that both we have and that we've been receiving from many of you all, it'll be a good opportunity for us to get on the same page about what our true worries and thoughts are about this change and what we need to do from here as we move forward. But first, if this is your first or 100th time joining us, welcome back. We are Clery Center, a national nonprofit training organization founded by Connie and Howard Clery, the parents of Jean Clery, for whom the Clery Act is named. And we here at Clery Center really focus our mission on partnering with colleges and universities to create safer campuses through understanding and implementing the Clery Act. And as we know, safety is relative, dependent on who you are and the identities that you hold. We at Clery Center are always looking for more opportunities to expand our own understanding of safety. And we hope that this is one more way and channel that we can do that today, what concerns you all have and what the implications really are of this big change from the department. So before we go ahead and start answering some of those questions, we'd love to just introduce all of ourselves to you a little bit more. Like I said, my name is Laura. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. And I am the Senior Director of Programs at Clery Center. I've been here for a little over 5 years, and my role focuses a lot on developing and implementing our programmatic resources, whether those are the long ago days of in-person trainings or our new days of virtual trainings. And I do a little bit of policy work as well as supporting our work on the Office on Violence Against Women campus grant also. And I have a background in school counseling and also student affairs administration in higher education. And so with that, I'm going to pass it to my colleague Abby for a chance for her to introduce herself.
Thank you so much. My name is Abigail Boyer. I'm the Associate Executive Director here at Clery Center. And in my little over 8 years working with Clery, I've been really lucky to work with our training and education team on training and technical assistance, and ultimately just working with campuses to figure out how do we take these regulations and apply them in practice. I also have a background in victim advocacy, which informs some of my training and technical assistance as well. And ultimately, we are so glad to be with all of you and answer some of these questions that we know that campuses are asking in relation to the removal of the handbook. So with that, I'll hand it over to Sarah.
Hello, everyone. My name is Sarah Barrett, and I am the Director of Training and Education, and I am the newest member to the Clery Center team. In my role, I develop comprehensive and engaging curriculum for our seminars, our webinars, and our National Awareness Months. My background is as a licensed marriage and family therapist, but the majority of my career has been spent in higher education, working both in student affairs and then in administration. I have a background in compliance, more specifically Clery compliance, and have worked to not only compile and publish the Clery report or the annual security report on a regular basis, but also written and implemented policy across the university. So excited to be here with you all today and to have this really important conversation.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Sarah and Abby. So let's get to it. So on Friday, October 9th, the Department of Education announced that they were rescinding the handbook and replacing it with an appendix to the Federal Student Aid Handbook, which is about 13 pages of some Clery-related information. Much of it is statutory and regulatory language with some additional guidance, as well in there. So Sarah and Abby, I have a question for both of you. Sarah first. With the handbook for campus safety and security reporting rescinded, what do campuses need to know now about how to comply with the Clery Act? What should they be using?
That's a great question, Laura. And really, the answer to that is pretty straightforward. It's the Clery Act statute and regulations. The handbook was sub-regulatory guidance, and it was never legally binding. And so the newly released appendix essentially reiterates the statutory and regulatory language while still providing some minimum guidance on CSAs, geography, and our Clery Act crimes as well.
Awesome. Thank you, Sarah. Abby, would you add anything to that?
Well, Sarah just mentioned the Clery Act crimes, so I'll just mention that for counting and classifying specifically, the statute and the regulations do derive some of their definitions from uniform crime reporting, which does have user manuals that the handbook really pulled heavily from. So I think in the absence of the handbook that had some of those campus-specific examples, institutions are going to rely more on those supporting user manuals from UCR to help support some of the decisions that they're making. So one thing that I know that we've been hearing from campuses is that the appendix seems vague on how to enact Clery Act requirements. I know a lot of folks really look to the handbook to figure out that application piece. So really the question that we're hearing is, what are we supposed to do now? So Laura, if you could start us off, where do campuses go from here?
Yeah, sure. Abby, I would be lying if I said I didn't have the same thought or reaction when I first heard the news of what was happening a couple weeks ago. And so, the department is coming from a place right now where they are feeling that the handbook demonstrated a little bit of overreach on the part of their own department. And they are stressing in this appendix the latitude and leverage that campuses really have to interpret the more ambiguous parts of the law. And I think that can feel kind of perhaps freeing for some people, but for the majority, it could be a little disconcerting. But so, for example, in the handbook, there was a list of roles that the department provided that they would consider to be CSAs. And so without the handbook, campuses don't have that list of roles per se, but they still have the regulations themselves to apply when making determinations around things like CSAs. Similarly, without the handbook, there is no longer this definition of reasonably contiguous in terms of on-campus geography, as that was something that was relative to the handbook only. That definition was not coming from regulations. And so, what the department is saying is that they want to empower campuses to make these decisions on their own, and that if they ever have questions or come to a point where they're looking for support, the department is going to be able to provide technical assistance in those areas, but they have not yet specified how one would reach out or obtain that technical assistance. So right now, what it feels like is an institution's internal policies and procedures are more important than ever, because in the absence of the handbook to look to for guidance, campuses are going to have to justify their decision making to the department by following their own policies and procedures. So just that's kind of where I think we are right now. But Sarah, would you add anything else in for that?
Yeah, Laura, I think you touched on some really important elements there, and specifically the idea of overreach, that perception. But for a lot of campuses, just like myself, when I was on campus and doing the work of Clery day in and day out, the handbook was a really helpful resource, and I could go to that as a guide and to look at some of that more plain language that I know can be really helpful as you're trying to do some of that interpretation or to look at some of the examples that were provided. And so for some campuses and professionals, this may feel like a loss. And, as we think about what that loss means for a lot of folks, they will have to kind of look internally to assess kind of where that support and resources or where those support and resources might exist on their own campuses. And so, that's where I would just say it's so important for folks to have those Clery compliance committees or teams working in coordination across campuses, across departments to really ensure that there's that compliance and something that we're actually going to be doing this December is hosting a free webinar about, kind of the process of building a Clery compliance team and really leveraging that support that does exist. So even though we may not have the handbook any longer, there are still resources and places in which we can rely on support to help really move forward that compliance and campus safety for each individual campus itself. And so with that, I actually have a question for Abby and Laura. As you think about some of the changes, should we be making changes to who is considered a campus security authority at our institution? Abby, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I'm going to use that magical phrase we hear so often in compliance, which is it depends. If you've recently put together your list of campus security authorities based on the definition of CSA that's in the regulations and statute, the removal of the handbook really likely isn't going to change that much for you. Because while the appendix doesn't offer examples of who the department would consider to be a CSAs, they are still defined in the regulation. And so you want to make sure as an institution, as my colleagues have been saying, that you have the ability to document and then articulate how or why a certain role met that definition of CSA. Remember, our CSAs fall in 4 categories: campus police and security, which is fairly straightforward, are individuals with responsibility with other security functions on campus, individuals who are written into our campus security policies as members of our community to whom individuals can make crime reports. But then there's that last category of individuals with significant responsibility for student and campus activities. And so if there's somebody who used to be considered a CSA when the handbook was still around, because they met that definition of officials with significant responsibility for student and campus activities, as that phrase was described and kind of expanded upon in the handbook, you as an institution should be prepared to describe why the function of that role in your interpretation no longer meets that definition. So, like I said, if you've recently made your list of CSAs based on those 4 definitions, it's likely that not a lot is going to change. But that list and how you made those decisions and how you documented those decisions, like Laura and Sarah were saying, is going to be really maybe even more critical now should you have a program review. Laura, would you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think you made some really strong points there, Abby. The one that sticks out for me right now is in relation to like a role like a Title IX coordinator. So, absent that list of example roles, I think a campus would really have to have a strong argument for why somebody that used to be a CSA or was considered a CSA, and now just because that list is gone, they're not, but their function hasn't changed. That would be difficult. So, for example, the Title IX coordinator definitely has a significant responsibility for student and campus activities, perhaps now even more so than the past. So just because they are no longer listed in guidance that the department wants campuses to rely on as an example of a role the department would consider to be a CSA, I think that's one of those more clear examples where their function still puts them squarely in one of the categories of being a CSA. So I think all of this is to say to campuses, just as you never totally relied on that list. And while that list maybe even gave you some frustration with some of the roles that the department was saying they would consider to be a CSA, we would urge you to do what you have always been doing, which is making an assessment based on the function of the roles at the institution and identify what category that role fits into, or whether it just does not fit into a role of one of the categories of a CSA, which is very possible. Oh boy, so there's so many thoughts. So I have kind of another trickier question here for you, Sarah. So this is, are there any changes for counting off-campus trips as part of non-campus geography because of the rescission of the handbook?
Once again, another great question, Laura. And in true Clery fashion, the answer is really, it just depends. Under previous guidance in the 2016 handbook, trips fell under the non-campus category if the institution owned or controlled property that was frequently used by students and used for educational purposes, but not within the institutional's reasonably contiguous on-campus geography. And so really with that in mind, institutions will need to determine uh, what frequent use by students means. The handbook gave institutions recommendations for how length or time or repeated use should be factored into those decisions, but ultimately the removal of the handbook will just give institutions flexibility to determine how they will consistently, going back to that consistent standard, how they will consistently evaluate frequent use. A campus is not necessarily prohibited from continuing to count those locations as they were for the past 4 years. The appendix did not give any guidance onto how to determine those, or whether an institution, whether or not an institution sponsored trip would fall into that Clery geography. So it's really up to the institutions to determine whether or not it makes sense moving forward, and if it supports overall campus safety to continue to count those institution sponsored trips as Clery geography or not. Anything you would add there, Abby?
One thing I keep on thinking as you were talking is we frequently will get calls from institutions and they'll be saying, this crime happened in this place. Is this Clery reportable? And so sometimes that question of whether or not it's Clery geography is coming up because there was an incident in that location. So I think this change is also a good reminder that that evaluation of what your Clery geography is ultimately should come before, unfortunately, an incident might occur there. So whether we're thinking about trips or some of our other Clery reportable locations, it really goes back to that drumbeat that we keep on hearing over and over in this conversation, which is, do we have a list of our CSAs? Do we have a list of what we've determined to be our Clery geography that we are identifying as an institution? And then when or if an incident happens in that location, we will know whether or not it's Clery reportable. So I think everything that you shared, Sarah, are such important considerations, because you're right, there really isn't clear guidance now on whether or how trips should fall into that non-campus category, although they certainly can because of the definition of non-campus itself. The other thing that I keep on thinking about, the elephant in the room, so to speak, for so many different campuses is, over the summer, institutions made a lot of significant changes to their policies as a result of new Title IX regulations. And so we know campuses have really been asking, so now that the handbook's been removed, does that impact whether or how we are adhering to these Title IX regulations? So Laura, could you speak a bit to whether this handbook removal will influence some of these new policies that campuses have enacted as a result of the Title IX regs?
Yes, I would be happy to, Abby. I'm always happy to share a more concrete answer. And so for this question, the answer is truly this rescission of the handbook does not impact directly an institution's ability or requirement to comply with either the Clery Act or Title IX. Both of these laws are still intact. For the Clery Act, campuses should look to the statute and its regulations as amended by the Violence Against Women Act. And for Title IX, you'll be looking to the regulations passed in May of this year. One area that stands out is that within the handbook that was just rescinded, there was a lot of helpful context and expansion on required resource provisions under the Clery Act for survivors of dating violence, domestic violence, sexual assault, and stalking. So that will certainly be missed without having that guidance to rely upon, particularly now as Title IX covers any incident that meets the definition of those 4 crimes as defined under Clery. So what we would recommend at this point for campuses, or what we would hope to tell campuses to do, is to look to the preamble of the final version of the Violence Against Women Act amendments to the Clery Act, where there is a little bit more discussion around how those resource provisions were decided upon or were reached. That gives a little bit of helpful context for how campuses might implement and apply those requirements. So that would just be the biggest thing I'd want to highlight there. But Sarah, would you add anything else before we wrap up?
Yeah, I would just highlight what you said and going back to the implementation. And so really this is an opportunity for campuses to go back and look at their internal policies and their protocols. Something that we say very often in training is do what you say and say what you do. And so really ensuring that your policies are reflective of your processes and your procedures on campus, and that those are consistently being interpreted in the same way and then executed in the same way. And so really this is going to be more important than ever, knowing that there are so many things going on in the compliance world, with the new Title IX regulations and now the handbook. Some folks may feel a little overwhelmed, but this is, like I said, a wonderful opportunity to go back, have that time to take some take an evaluation and look through what your policies are, and really to determine if there might be some gaps that exist, and an
Mm.
opportunity for you to ensure that you are doing what you say that you do and that you're moving your compliance programs further.
Awesome. That was some really great advice and recommendations right there at the end, Sarah. And, the theme that we really have seen, even from the answers Abby and you have been sharing today, is consistent with what Clery Center has always pushed around Clery compliance, which is the need to truly institutionalize the work you do around this law and come together as a campus working with the people that, enact the requirements, but that might require a little bit of cross-departmental collaboration now more than ever. Looking at your policies and procedures, aligning them or comparing them to what the regulations call for. So we are here as a helpful provider of answers to any of those questions that might come up for you. We eagerly await more information from the Department of Education. As they indicated, they are looking to provide more technical assistance on the Clery Act as well, in addition to what already exists with the help desk. But in lieu of that, Clery Center is here to continue to do the work we've always done, which is providing that information, that education, and those resources to you all in as accessible a way as possible. So we hope you found our conversation helpful today, and that maybe you feel like you got some answers to questions that you have had. If you didn't, or if you have other questions now based on what we shared, please send those to info@clerycenter.org, and we'd be happy to answer them directly, or perhaps gather together for another conversation that we can record and share with you all. But Sarah and Abby, thank you so much for taking the time out to do this today. And, I truly do miss working with you both in person. So it's always just nice to be able to see your faces. And I feel a little bit better about so many areas that we had a little bit of questions about. But thank you so much. And thanks to everyone that is watching. We really are appreciative. So have a good rest of your day.